44 years. That's how long Eddie Hill strapped himself into machines that could kill him, and the thing that finally stopped him wasn't old age, wasn't a loss of nerve, and wasn't a decision he made himself. It was a defective piece of metal that somebody knew was bad before it ever reached his engine. And if you want to understand why that matters, you have to start at the very beginning, because this story doesn't make sense unless you understand exactly what kind of man we're talking about. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about the drivers who built this sport before there was a sport to build. If you're someone who loves the real stories behind motorsports history, the ones that go deeper than the highlight reels and the championship trophies, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Here's the thing. When most people think about drag racing legends, they think about the famous names with the factory backing and the television time and the polished haulers lined up in professional pit lanes. What they don't think about is a kid from Longview, Texas, winning his first trophy on a Cushman motor scooter at a flat track event in Shreveport, Louisiana, and then spending the next 4.5 decades building one of the most complete and unlikely careers in the history of American motorsport. Eddie Hill was born on March 6, 1936, in the kind of town where professional racing wasn't even a concept you could hold in your head. Longview in the 1930s and 40s was oil country and cotton country, and about as far from any sanctioning body or television contract as you could possibly get. His father was Dr. James Hill, his mother was Evelyn Hill, and from a young age the kid showed the kind of competitive streak that either burns out completely or turns into something serious. In Hill's case, it turned into something serious. By the time he graduated Longview High School and made his way to Texas A&M, he was already the type of person who needed to understand how things worked, not just how to drive them fast. He came out of College Station in 1957 with a degree in industrial technology. That is not the resume of someone who backs into success by accident. That is an engineer's mind attached to a racer's nerve, and in drag racing during the mid-1950s, that particular combination was rare enough to matter in a very real way. Now, you might be thinking, okay, another driver with a technical background, that's not exactly a unique story. But here's what most people don't realize about what drag racing actually was in 1955. There were no sanctioning bodies with real authority. There were no television contracts. There was no manufacturer money sitting behind every car on the starting line. It was men building things in home garages out of whatever surplus parts they could locate, and then driving those same things to the track themselves because nobody had a proper trailer or a full crew or even the budget for a second set of tires. Hill built a hot rod out of a Model T frame with an Oldsmobile V8 stuffed into it. And in 1955, at 19 years old, he drove that car himself to a strip called Flying Fish Lodge in Karnak, Texas, and won the event running roughly 106 miles an hour. That was the world Eddie Hill came up in. A world where the man who built the car was the man who drove the car, and usually the man who hauled it home afterward when something broke on the way back. There was no separation between the engineer and the driver because there was simply no budget for one. If something failed, you fixed it yourself. And if you were exceptional, you found a way to make it faster than anyone next to you had any right to anticipate. He went to work as a sales engineer for a foundry in Wichita Falls after college. By 1958, he had built his second dragster out of scrap aluminum H-beams he had sourced directly from his own employer. And 2 years after that, after earning $500 in appearance money racing a driver named Jack Chrisman out in Inyukern, California, he quit the foundry job entirely and committed to racing full-time. He was 24 years old, and had just bet his entire future on his own hands and his own mind being good enough to earn a living going fast. Nobody handed Eddie Hill anything. Not the trophy at Shreveport, not the dragster built from scrap metal, not the second and third careers that came later. He built all of it himself, starting from a motor scooter and a Model T frame, and by the time this story really starts moving, He had already spent several years proving that a man could outthink and outbuild and outdrive most of what the sport threw at him. By 1961, Hill had built something that looked less like a race car and more like a science experiment that nobody had officially approved yet. He called it the Double Dragon, and it ran 2 full Pontiac engines mounted side by side, each one with its own clutch, its own drive shaft, and its own rear-end feeding power to 4 rear tires instead of the conventional 2. When he fired that machine up at the NHRA Nationals in Indianapolis, it produced so much power that it physically dug holes into the fresh asphalt of the starting line. Officials didn't know what to do with him. Legendary starter Buster Couch grabbed Hill by the ear and walked him physically to a different part of the line because nobody had ever built anything quite like it before, and nobody was ready to let it loose right next to the rest of the field. That car was a glimpse of exactly who Eddie Hill was going to be for the rest of his career. He didn't build what everyone else was building. He built what he believed would win and handled the rules problem afterward. It's worth sitting with that for a moment, because that instinct becomes the shape of everything that follows. But it almost ended him right there, and this is the part people consistently overlook when they remember only the champion he eventually became. In 1966, the Double Dragon was destroyed in a crash. Not long after that, an engine fire broke out at Green Valley Race City in Smithfield, Texas, one of those fireballs you couldn't see through, as Hill described it later. Between the wrecked car and the fire, his finances were gone completely. There was no sponsor waiting with a checkbook because in 1966, that level of money simply didn't exist yet in drag racing. A racer in that era was on his own the moment something like this happened. Racing stopped being something Eddie Hill could afford, and so at 30 years old, he walked away from the sport that would eventually call him one of its greatest champions. Not because he lost his nerve. Because the math stopped working. He didn't walk away from speed entirely, because that was never really something he was capable of. Hill opened a motorcycle dealership in Wichita Falls called Eddie Hill's Fun Cycles, and that shop is still operating today as the oldest Honda and Kawasaki dealership in the state of Texas. Running a motorcycle business naturally led to racing motorcycles, and Hill turned out to be just as dangerous on 2 wheels as he had been on 4. He won the Texas State Road Racing Championship in 1972. The year before that, he showed up at Daytona and outran the factory Kawasaki riders in early qualifying, turning a lap of 151 miles per hour, which was quicker than what factory rider Gary Nixon could produce that day. A factory rider means Kawasaki itself was paying that man to be fast on their equipment. And here came a motorcycle shop owner from Wichita Falls outrunning him on a track he had no business keeping pace on. This was a man who had supposedly quit racing, running laps faster than the manufacturer's own paid talent. Motorcycles weren't where it ended though, because in 1974 Hill attended a drag boat race in Austin, Texas, and something about it hooked him completely. Within a month, he was racing his own boat. 2 years later he switched to nitromethane fuel, and from 1978 through 1984 he ran blown fuel hydroplanes and simply dominated the discipline, winning 55 of 103 races he entered. He became a 4-time ADBA world champion. He topped the SDBA points standings 5 consecutive years. He won the NDBA Nationals 4 separate times. Different letters, different organizations, same result every single time. Eddie Hill's name at the top, regardless of who was keeping score. In September of 1982, at Chowchilla, California, he set a world quarter-mile water speed record of 229 miles per hour, which entered the Guinness Book of World Records and stood for a full decade. At one point Hill simultaneously held the speed record in all 4 major drag boat sanctioning bodies at the same time. Every organization sanctioning drag boat racing in America was pointing at the same man. He even ran a 5.16-second boat pass that was quicker than the fastest top fuel car on land at the time. Think about what that actually means. A boat skimming across open water was outrunning the best purpose-built dragsters in the country running on rubber and asphalt. This is where it gets really interesting. The man who had walked away from land racing because he couldn't afford it anymore had gone out and built a second career on water that made his old sport look slow by comparison. Somewhere in the middle of all that winning, Hill met a woman named Ursie at a drag boat event in High Point, North Carolina. They married on Valentine's Day, 1984, and from the very start Ursie was not a driver's wife standing quietly on the sidelines. She became co-owner of the operation, the record keeper tracking more than 300 data points on every single run, the business manager handling sponsors and press. Hill called her Baby Cakes, and he insisted her name appear on the car in letters exactly the same size as his own. That was not a small gesture in a sport where plenty of drivers treated their wives as scenery. Whatever this story turns into later, Ursie is not a footnote in it. She is built into the foundation of everything that follows, and she is standing right beside Hill for every single thing that is about to happen to him for the rest of this account. 8 months after that wedding, the sport nearly took Hill away from her permanently. In October of 1984, out at Firebird Lake near Phoenix, Arizona, Hill was running his boat at roughly 200 miles an hour when the blower let go. The boat flipped and threw him out in front of it at full speed. He broke 7 bones. He suffered a concussion. He was bleeding from his eyes. Took his Aggie ring clean off his finger, blew his shoes off, blew his face shield off. He spent 5 days in the hospital and a full year healing. That crash ended his water racing career permanently, meaning that the most dominant decade any driver had ever produced on water closed not with a trophy, but with an ambulance ride. So here's where Eddie Hill stood at the start of 1985. He was 49 years old. He had already walked away from drag racing once because he ran out of money. He had just spent a year recovering from a boat wreck serious enough to nearly kill him. Most men in that position take the hint and stay retired. Eddie Hill was never built that way. Instead, Hill bought a used Top Fuel operation that had previously belonged to Dan Pastorini, a name football fans will recognize as a former NFL quarterback who had spent time racing himself. The car had originally been built for a racer named Frank Taylor and driven by a man named Rocky Epperly to a 257-mile-an-hour national speed record, so the foundation of the thing was solid. What Hill didn't have was money or a current understanding of how much the sport had evolved while he was away on the water. It showed immediately. The sport he was walking back into in 1985 was not the sport he had left in 1966. Top Fuel had turned into a professional business with real sponsorship money, full-time crews, and a level of tuning sophistication that simply didn't exist when Hill was racing the Double Dragon. He was starting over against competitors who had spent 20 years building the exact knowledge base Hill was still trying to acquire. He failed to qualify at the Mile High Nationals in Denver that first year. At Indianapolis, things got so tight that Hill needed to win a bracket race side event just to collect enough cash to buy fuel to get the car home. A former world champion on the water, reduced to racing for gas money on land. And if you had asked most people in the pits that week whether this comeback was going anywhere, the honest answer would have been no. A 49-year-old with a boat racer's instincts trying to learn an entirely different discipline on asphalt with none of the budget his competitors carried. On paper, it looked like a mistake. Look, 1986 was worse before it got better. At the Gator Nationals, the team was completely out of spares and Hill damaged the engine on a qualifying run. By his own account, he was ready to quit right there in the pits, holding a burned piston in his hand and wondering whether any of this had been worth coming back for. It was Ursie who wouldn't let it end there. She took that piston next door to fellow Texan Gene Snow and his crew chief Larry Meyer and asked them directly what had gone wrong. Meyer looked at it and told her flat out they weren't supplying the engine enough fuel. Snow ended up selling them a replacement engine and a baseline tune-up to go along with it. Hill has said that single diagnosis rescued the entire operation from permanent obscurity. Even with the fix in place, Hill lost 15 consecutive opening rounds before he finally won one. On the one-year anniversary of his return to the sport, he made it all the way to the final round back in Denver only to have a reverser bearing fail so the car wouldn't back up after the burnout. He had to hand the win to Larry Minor instead. Close, but not close enough. Not yet. Here's what most people don't realize about how this operation actually ran during those years. None of it happened with a polished professional crew behind it. Hill's crew chief through the toughest stretch was a man named Terry Carter, who everyone simply called Fuzzy on account of his red hair and beard. Fuzzy had exactly zero background in racing before joining up with Hill. He had spent his working life driving trucks hauling used oil field pipe around West Texas. He worked his way from truck driver to engine man simply by paying attention and refusing to stop asking questions when something went wrong. Hill let him carry the foreman title, though Hill himself remained the owner, the driver, the primary tuner, and the person who selected every single component that went on the car. By Hill's own description, they were probably the poorest top fuel team in the sport for a good long while. Around the shop and at the track, the operation always had animals underfoot, including a dachshund named Hot Dog and a Siamese cat named Monkey Butt. This was not a factory effort. This was a Texas trucker and a comeback driver, and that driver's wife running handwritten data sheets trying to outthink teams with 10 times their budget. And somehow it worked. Fuzzy learned Nitro tuning the exact same way Hill had learned everything else across his career, by getting his hands into the work and paying very close attention whenever something went wrong instead of waiting for somebody else to fix it. Off the track, Hill was building something else entirely. He was a committed Christian, and in 1985, he helped start a Sunday worship service for racers called Racers for Christ that began with roughly 8 people attending. By 1999, that same service was drawing more than 400 people every single week. Hill also ran a charitable organization called the Hill Foundation, funding things like a kitchen serving homeless families out in Pomona, California, and maintaining a prize fund that paid out to charity at every race weekend. He once helped purchase a replacement van for a church near the Oklahoma City bombing site after their own vehicle was destroyed in the blast. Around 1994, Hill stopped drawing a personal salary from his own racing operation altogether. The man who had once needed a bracket race win just to buy fuel home was now giving away more than he kept for himself. Ask Hill who he modeled himself after and he never hesitated. Don Garlits had been his hero from the beginning, he said, and he always tried to pattern himself accordingly. That says something specific about a man who by the mid-90s had championships across 2 different sports and was still pointing to someone else as his standard. He also maintained his physical conditioning in a way that most men his age never bothered with. By his early 60s, Hill was performing 80 push-ups, 80 sit-ups, and 12 minutes on a treadmill every single day just so his body could handle what the car was going to demand from it. Away from the track, he and Ursie managed a 500-acre ranch raising Angus cattle and Tennessee walking horses. And if you wanted to know what Hill actually listened to during those quieter hours, it wasn't what you'd guess. He preferred Mario Lanza and Luciano Pavarotti above everything else. By the fall of 1987, the racing picture finally began to shift. Hill set the national speed record at Texas Motorplex running 295.98 miles per hour, and in doing so became the only person in motorsport history to simultaneously hold the land speed record and the water speed record at the same time. Sponsors took notice. Super Shops and Pennzoil both signed on at the Winter Nationals in Pomona, giving the operation real financial support for the first time since Hill had returned from the water. The broke comeback kid finally had a budget that matched his ambition. 1988 is the year Eddie Hill went from a compelling story to an outright legend. It started in March when he won the Gator Nationals, beating Joe Amato in the final round. Amato at that point was one of the most consistently dominant drivers in the sport, so that win alone would have made for a memorable season by any reasonable standard. But then on April 9th, Hill did something nobody in the history of the sport had ever managed. He ran a 4.990 second pass at Texas Motorplex in Ennis, Texas, becoming the first driver in history to break into the 4-second zone. That number, 4.990, on April 9th, which happened to be his 49th birthday at 52 years old. People still bring that up. The run earned him a nickname that attached itself permanently. They started calling him the forefather of drag racing, and from that point forward the sport's entire conception of what was achievable had to be recalibrated around what this particular man had just done in a garage operation that had nearly folded twice before it ever got to this point. Every young driver in the pits had grown up with the assumption that the 4-second barrier was still years away from being broken, and that whoever finally got there would be running a factory-backed program with a purpose-built car and a driver half Hill's age. Instead, it was a Texan who had already buried one racing career, almost killed himself in a boat, come back broke, and then spent 3 years losing round after round before he finally figured out how to win consistently. That is the man who rewrote what the sport thought was possible. Success didn't make the car any safer, though. At the Winter Nationals in 1989, an adjustable front wing built by chassis specialist Dave Uehara failed roughly 1,000 feet down the track and sent the car into a violent blowover. A blowover at that speed means the front end of the chassis lifts clean off the ground and the entire machine can flip end over end with nothing protecting the driver except a roll cage and whatever luck happens to be available that afternoon. Hill walked away from it, but it was a reminder that every single record he had just broken carried the exact same level of risk attached to it as the ones before. Speed doesn't get safer simply because you get better at managing it. If anything, the faster you go, the less margin remains for anything to go wrong. By 1993, Hill was 57 years old and most of his competitors were young enough to be his sons. That didn't slow him down. He won a record-tying 6 of 7 national event finals that season and took the NHRA Winston Top Fuel World Championship, making him the oldest champion in the history of the series. That record still stands today. It was also the 12th national championship of his career counting both land and water, which meant that by the time 1993 closed out, Eddie Hill had assembled one of the most complete competitive resumes in the history of American motorsport, and had done almost all of it after the age at which most professional athletes have long since moved into broadcasting or retirement. He wasn't beating a weak field to get there, either. Joe Amato alone had been running near the front of Top Fuel for years, and Hill had been trading final round appearances with him going all the way back to that Gator Nationals meeting in 1988. The competitors Hill was beating in 1993 had grown up inside the sport's modern professional infrastructure with sponsorship, specialized equipment, and technical support that Hill never had access to when he was their age. He beat them anyway, consistently and decisively. The wins kept accumulating. He took the Winter Nationals in 1995. Then in 1996, he won the Mile High Nationals in Denver at 60 years old, becoming the oldest Eliminator winner in NHRA history. Another record that still stands, because most drivers his age had moved to the broadcast booth by then, and Hill was still strapping into a nitromethane-fueled dragster and beating people young enough to be his grandchildren. Then came July of 1997, at the Sonoma Nationals out at Sears Point. This is a run that should have defined his career all by itself, and for about 15 seconds it looked like it was going to. Hill laid down a career-best pass, 4.674 seconds at 310.88 miles per hour. The fastest he had ever gone in his life, across any surface, in any vehicle, in 40-plus years of doing this at the absolute limit of what was possible. And then just past the finish line, the front end of his dragster snapped off. The chassis separated behind it. Hill said later that about 8 inches in front of his eyes, he watched a massive shower of bright orange sparks flying past at what had to be at least 150 miles per hour, and that he remembers thinking twice within those few seconds that this might actually be the one that finally gets him. It wasn't. He walked away with a burn on his shoulder and 2 broken toes, which by the standards of what a chassis coming apart at over 300 miles per hour can do to a human body is as close to miraculous as anything you'll find documented in the sport's history. The crash was significant enough that NHRA changed an existing rule because of it. At the time, a driver was required to race whatever car had posted the fastest qualifying time, even into eliminations, with no provision to swap to a backup regardless of how badly the qualifying car had been damaged. That rule was rewritten after Sonoma, and inside the sport people still refer to it informally as the Eddie Hill Rule. A governing body with decades of established procedures rewrote its own regulations because of what happened to this one man on this one weekend. He was 61 years old. He had just survived a crash at more than 300 miles an hour and walked away thinking calmly about how close it had come to being the end. Most drivers who live through something like that find a dignified way to step back. Eddie Hill climbed back into a car 2 years later. By October of 1999, Eddie Hill was 63 years old and had already survived more serious incidents than most drivers accumulate across 3 separate careers combined. He had gone broke and walked away from the sport once. He had been thrown from a flipping boat at 200 miles an hour and broken 7 bones. He had survived a blowover in 1989 and a chassis failure at Sears Point in 1997, and both times he had come back and kept racing. Every time something tried to end Eddie Hill's time in a race car, he had found a path back in, whether that meant a motorcycle dealership funding the return or a bracket race covering the fuel cost home. None of it had stuck yet. He was still strapping in, still running near the front, still holding records that younger drivers couldn't touch. At the O'Reilly Fall Nationals at Texas Motorplex in October of that year, his number 7 cylinder let go in the first round against Doug Herbert. The explosion broke the top left frame rail, bent the right side of the chassis, and dented the roll cage. Hill came away with a bruised lower back and a bruised right shoulder. He lost the round. It was a hard hit, but not beyond anything he had absorbed before in one form or another across 44 years of doing this. Before the team even loaded up for the next event, Hill was straightforward about how he felt. And there is something almost unsettling about how plainly he said it in hindsight. He said, "I would like to say running Houston will be fun, but I think I will wait until after the first round of qualifying before I can say anything. I'm still sore, and I'm sure it will get worse before it gets better." He had absolutely no idea how precisely right he was about to be. A week later at the Matco Tools Super Nationals at Houston Raceway Park, the team rolled out the car. Hill climbed in on October 30th for his 3rd qualifying run of the weekend. Routine procedure for a driver who had been posting sub-5-second passes for over a decade. Stage the car. Run the number. Come back and do it again. He had done this hundreds of times on this exact surface and dozens of others. The engine block under the hood was brand new. It had never made a single qualifying pass before that run. 4.38 seconds into the pass, it simply came apart. Here's what most people don't realize about what these engines are actually doing under the hood during a qualifying run. A supercharged nitromethane engine is compressing its fuel charge to somewhere in the range of 45 to 50 pounds of boost. That is a violent amount of pressure measured against any engineering standard you want to apply. If something interrupts that compression cycle even for a fraction of a second, the pressure has to go somewhere, and it does not dissipate quietly. A block machined from solid billet aluminum can sometimes survive an event like that because the metal itself is consistent and dense all the way through the material. A block that was cast rather than machined from solid stock can hide porosity inside it that is completely invisible from the outside during any standard inspection. Tiny air pockets formed right into the metal during the original casting process itself. Under normal operating stress, a block carrying that kind of hidden flaw might run for years without revealing itself. Under the pressure loads a nitromethane engine generates at full throttle, it is not a question of whether a hidden structural flaw like that eventually surfaces. It is only ever a question of when, and of how violently it does when it finally goes. Hill described what happened to his block in terms that left no ambiguity. It was a defective cast block, he said. Extremely porous and brittle. Actually a reject block that should have been rejected and scrapped, but instead somebody sold it to us as a good one. Read that back slowly, because that one sentence is the entire story compressed into its smallest possible form. Not a component that failed under conditions nobody could have reasonably anticipated. A component that somebody already knew should never have left the manufacturing floor. A part that was knowingly passed along anyway. Hill has never named that somebody publicly in any documented source anyone has been able to locate. The block passed through multiple hands before it reached his engine, and by the time it failed on that track in Houston, there was no clean trail back to exactly where the decision was made and who understood what they were selling. Stop and let that land for a full second. A 63-year-old man who had already survived a fire, a flipping boat at 200 miles an hour, a blowover, and a chassis failure at over 300 miles per hour, was taken permanently out of the sport not by his own speed, not by his own error in judgment, not by any failure of preparation or courage or physical conditioning, but by a transaction that happened somewhere off-camera long before he ever climbed into the car that morning. Someone knew that block was wrong. Someone sold it anyway. What is entirely beyond dispute is what the block did when it let go. It shattered and took the rest of the engine with it in the same instant. The block halves, the cylinder head, the headers, the intake, the blower, and the injector hat all separated from the car and slid down the racing surface right alongside him. The internal components, the crankshaft, the connecting rods, the pistons, the bearings, remained more or less contained within whatever was left of the case structure. An engine that had been assembled as a single functioning unit came apart into identifiable pieces scattered across hundreds of feet of racetrack in the span of a fraction of a second. It was by any account one of the most catastrophic engine failures anyone in the sport had witnessed before or since, and Eddie Hill was still strapped into what remained of the chassis while it happened on all sides of him. The fireball reached him with sufficient force to throw his head and shoulders forward inside the cockpit. His own butterfly steering wheel, the wheel he was holding with both hands at the time, put a dent directly into the front of his helmet. That is the physics of what happened. The concussive pressure from the engine failure was strong enough to drive the steering wheel hard enough into his helmet to leave a visible mark in the shell. Hill said later that being shoved forward that violently compressed his spine enough that something had to give, and what gave was his L1 vertebra, a 40% compression fracture. The most pain he said he had ever felt in his life. This from a man who had broken 7 bones simultaneously in a single boat crash 15 years earlier and kept racing. He told the safety safari to cut the roll cage off the car to extract him. Think about what that specific decision means coming from this particular man. Hill had walked away from wrecked machinery across his entire career on land and water. Every single time before this one, he had either climbed out under his own power or been extracted with the car still reasonably intact around him. In 44 years of hard crashes on 2 different surfaces, that October afternoon in Houston was the only time Eddie Hill ever directed anyone to cut one of his own cars apart to reach him. He knew his own body well enough after everything he had survived to understand that this time was categorically different from everything that had come before it. The safety crew lifted him straight up and out without allowing his spine to flex in any direction. Ursie was right there watching every second of it, and she said later that the pain was severe enough that tears were literally projecting forward out of his eyes from the force of what his body was going through. He left Houston Raceway Park in an ambulance. It was the last ride he would ever take at a drag strip. The same way an ambulance had carried him away from Firebird Lake in 1984, ending his water racing career at 200 miles an hour. 2 careers on 2 completely different surfaces, separated by 15 years, both of them ending identically. Hill strapped down, sirens running, the sport continuing behind him without him in it. Eddie Hill never drove a top fuel car again. Not that weekend, not the following season, not in any exhibition capacity afterward. Neither he nor Ursie has been back to a drag race since that night in Houston. The moment was significant enough and visually striking enough that it outlasted the racetrack itself. Motorsports artist Kenny Youngblood painted the explosion, capturing the block coming apart in the exact instant of failure. Youngblood called him Engine Eddie in his own written account of the piece, and said that once Hill had done what he had done not once but twice across this era of the sport, putting it on canvas was something he simply had to do. That painting hangs today in the Hill home in Wichita Falls, right next to another Youngblood piece documenting the 4.990-second pass that first made Eddie Hill famous. 2 paintings on the same wall of the same house. One from April of 1988 and one from October of 1999. The best moment of his career and the most violent one, hanging side by side where he and Ursie see them every single day. The man who broke the 4-second barrier and the man who survived Houston, sharing a wall, in the home of the same person who lived both of those moments inside the same car, on the same strip, trusting the same hands that built everything he ever raced.